Hi class, this is Christian. In this video, I just want to go over the app with you to see what it looks like in its final state. So this is the home page that loads a home component here. Otherwise, it would just be a blank shell. I did have these two images here, and I'll also show you how to do that. It's very easy. And then you would link that to their correct location. So if I click here, it's going to take me to the flight list, as you can see here. And these navigations are also working. That will take to the add form. I can also go there from here, and the about page is just a filler. I just put some random text in here to make it not too boring. So this is the app that you were building. You were been doing that for the last couple of weeks, and so the most of the functionalities are inside this flight list and the add flight here. So if it's I don't know how far you are, but by now you should be able to, build this list. And I added a new button down here at the bottom left to say delete all. That will wipe out every data here. Okay, so make sure that also make sure that your navigations are working. That means when I move around, you see that I do not reload my page. If you do reload the page, you see this logo spinning, and you see a slight or a quick flash of your screen. But for now, every data is loaded instantly without refreshing the page. So therefore, your data are or the state of the data are retained. What I mean is, if I delete this couple of records here, you see that I deleted three records, and they should remain intact, even though I navigate around and come back to that page. Okay, and just because I'm not reloading my page, and the data we store are inside a file, and we just store this data in the RAM. So that's why it's important to make sure the links are working as they should. And so last week you created the routes for the site. So that means, like I showed you here, you should navigate to those particular pages without any issues. And so this week you were going to create the forms to add a new flight as well as to edit a particular flight, as you can see here. So the edit in the form uses exactly the same form. Okay, it's not no difference here. The only difference is when I edit, it will load the ID based on what I have in the URL, and it will fetch that record from the source, the data, and pre-populate all of these with the correct data in the store already. And then I can, edit these based on the validation requirements. Okay, so if there are no changes in the edit mode, then if I click submit, you should have a successful edit because nothing changes really. Or you can put a different message saying nothing's changed. But if I go back and edit something, for example, if I notice that the ID 1 is exactly the same as the one I'm editing, right? So in this scenario, I'm allowing my user to edit the ID. In the assignment, I ask you not to do that. You don't have to because it's an extra step. But if you want to, that's fine. And so if I put the changes to an ID that already existed in the database or in the file, it should throw an error because 10 is in there, right? So you see that 10, it says this ID is already exists. Try again. These are the validation messages you can create. There are a couple of ways you can do. In Angular, you have a built-in validator class that you can use to validate, or you can build your own custom validation, or just do your typical way of doing that using your own techniques and so on. So I'm putting both in here, the built-in validator and I'm just using my normal way to validate data fields and also Bootstrap. I'm using Bootstrap to kind of highlight the area where there is an error and put a message here. Okay, so that would mean it's existed. I check for that. These are just the same validation, right? It has a minimum number of characters and so on. So I also coded so that in my HTML, I mean that template, I force this field, the departure airport and in arrival airport, to be all caps. Okay, so they're consistent. That means I can type any character and they should be all uppercase by default. And so all these are validated right now. So if I put in just one character, I should get that's the error too, right? Until I have like more than 5 characters, then that's okay. Same thing here. If I put just one character, right? Again, error here. Some airlines here, maybe United flights or something. Okay, and then these are also validated. One character is not allowed, right? Two or more, based on the requirements, and you cannot have the same airport either, right? So you get an additional message saying the airports cannot be the same. You can't go and say come back to the same airport, I guess, unless it's emergency, right? So that's that, and then the dates are also validated. If you go on a date, on a future date, but return in the past, right? That's not allowed, right? You cannot return to the a earlier departure date, so that's validated. And if I change that, then everything should be good, except for this ID field, it's duplicated. So I put like a 101, that should pass. And now I updated that record. If I go back, you see that the first flight has been changed to the one I just edited. Okay, so the edit form uses a reactive template or reactive form, and I'll show you a little bit what it looks like. I'll be showing you different videos how to do that as well. And the add flight, you can see, looks exactly the same, except it has no data. I pre-populate the first field with the ID of 1. You don't have to, but I'm just saying you can. And I make this also a field type of number, and so you cannot go below 1, right? You cannot have negative numbers, and you can use the arrows or you just type it in. And again, 5 is already in the list, so you can see that that should not be, actually it should throw an error here. That's not working for this one. And these are all caught by the validation. The date here, let me go back and do it again. So the date, I coded so that it automatically populates with today's date or the current date. And you can do that very easily in Angular, just from 1 or 2 lines of code. I'll show you how to do that. And then again, the validation same as I showed you before. This trip type, even though it's required, I made it so that it's you don't have to do anything, right? It's already selected. You don't have any other choice. So this one is already taken care of. You don't have to validate this field unless you have it so that people are manually in type those data in, and that's something else. But this type is pretty simple, and the same applies. So AA, they cannot be less than 2 characters, and the arrival port cannot be the same. Okay, so all these validations are also built into the system. You can use Angular's validators to do that, or you can just build your own. Again, this form here is using the template-driven form. Okay, so there are 2 types, reactive and template-driven, and there's a third one called the dynamic form, but we're not going to do that. So, right, so this is what the app looks like. And also, if I go over here, I added additional messages saying that if I delete all of these data, right, and show a message saying there's no more data to load. Okay, the only time to load this data back is to refresh the page, or you can build another button to say reload, and you can reload that back. But I didn't do that, so refresh it, and the delete all button should also work. This is very simple, just 1 line of code basically, and wipe out the whole data here. All right, so just one more thing. Now, when we do edits and add flight, unless you are adding data to the same component, that can be done. But now we have separate components, one for each. So the flight list lists all these flights. Let me reload this again. So this is the one flight, the single source of truth. It has to be retained somewhere, right? And because now we're using routers, we don't really pass the data like we did before to the child component, through the template. So when you navigate to a page, you load that entire component in a router path or router outlet. So that means we're not actually passing the data from this flight to the add or to the edit anymore. Okay, but the actual data is coming from the same data you see here. So that means in order for this to work, you have to use a service. And I'll show you how to do that as well in a separate video. Now we're moving the flight data to a service, and then we'll pass that service as an injector, or we inject that into each component that uses it. So the flight list uses that, the add flight uses that, and also the edit page uses that as well. So all those 3 components will use the same service to pass the same form or the same data to those components. So if you make any changes, then you are making the changes to the actual form, I mean data. same as if you pull this data from a database table, so the connection remains intact. Okay, so that's important, and I'll show you do that. So that's the way to go here. Okay, so I'm going to show you really quickly in the back end the code here. So here in the project, I added a new file called utils. Okay, I'll show you what that means. But so here's my service. Okay, the service is here, and the service is very easy to create. Basically, just two imports, and you import the model, the actual flight data, and then in here you create the functions, basically functions to handle all your operations, like the delete, the CRUD operations, right? Add, update, delete all, delete one. All these are happen here because they will modify the original file. So the data source is right here now in this service file, this flight service, and you're going to inject the service to those components because this is not related to any component, right? So it's been shared across all components. So you create that, and again, I'll show you how to do that very, very easily. And then I added the components for the about. Here you can see I just put some very simple text in here. Okay, just filler basically, and nothing in the about component source. And the home page, I added the two images. So as you can see, images are just like this, just like you do in your normal HTML. Just make sure that they are inside the assets folder, okay? And that's what the assets is for, right? So if you go to the assets, you put your images, CSS, and all these index. You've seen this before inside here, and you can access it directly using this, relative path to those images. And then you just set the information you need as for a regular HTML, and that should work. So as you can see, I'm using the router link to make sure my page does not refresh when I navigate there. Okay, I mentioned this last time. And so that's home page. And then in the main component, the root component, as you can see, there's nothing there anymore, right? It's all empty, just a shell now. Because in the app component HTML, you see that again, there's nothing there. Everything's moved to their own individual component. So all you have is just the root tag, I guess, and then all your data will be rendered into this router outlet tag, right? When you navigate to the home page, everything's loaded here. You navigate to the flight list page, it's loaded in here. That's why I mentioned that you don't pass the data directly anymore, like we did before. Before we would say, you put here, you bind to the child, and you pass the data to the child component. Well, you don't get to do that because now you're rendering in an outlet. So that's why you need a service to inject the data to each component. Okay, so this is just a shell. And then now in the flight list component, if I go in here, and so here I have the list. So you can see that I am using the service, the flight data service I created from the service file. And once you import that, you inject it into the constructor this way. Okay, this is called injection. We call this dependency injection, sort of. You're injecting into the constructor, and as a flight data service type, just create a local variable and use that variable inside this class. You reference it using this flight service, and then this object here points to everything you saw over here in the flight service. I mean, you can access the data here. You can access this get flight, add flight ID function. All these functions here are available for you. Okay, once you import it and inject it into your constructor like this. That's why I'm able to access the flight data from here. So I don't store the data here anymore, right? It's from that service. And I use that for the display of my information, right? So here is the, when I initialize it, I kind of pretty much reassign data to a local variable so I can use that locally, and then I can just use my delete to delete the data. Notice when I delete here, I have a local function called delete, but really when I call it here, I'm actually passing that ID back out to the original function up here in the flight service. This function here, flight service dot delete flight. I pass in the ID here. I make sure it's number. That's all. And I pass the ID to this delete flight over here. This is the function actually gets called and does the deletion for you. Okay, because the data, again, the data source is retained in this class. Okay, so these are just basically um, you know relaying this information to the original functions to delete their or do their processing. So delete all will again call its own delete all function in this service. Okay, and for this flight list, I just have two of them, right? Delete a single record and delete all the records here, as you can see in the list file. So this is for the list, and the add flight, very similar. Again, I import that service, inject it the same way. Once you inject it here, it's like you're having the entire source of data inside your file. And then I use that object to access the flight data, and I assign that to a local variable called gFlightData. G means for global, I guess, because I'm going to create another local data here, right, to store my data. And my local variable is called just flight data. And this is the one that is being added to, is going to be added to the original data file. So that's why it's here. And then this is the just default data. I can use that to populate the field. That's what you saw. I chose the one way as the default selection. The ID, I make it as a default one. The rest are all blank. And then the date, I call the function, which I created here, and returns the date in this format. So it's very easy in Angular. You just use this function here, return the date. First you get today's date, and then from today's date you convert it to an ISO string, and then from there you get the substring 0 and 10, and it will automatically and magically put zeros in front of your numbers. Okay, if it's less than 10, then add a 0 to the front. That's what it means. Like if it's January, then you say 01, or if it's the 5th, then say 05 here. And the reason why it does that is because your form in the HTML requires to have 2 digits. So if you have like just the first of the month will be just 1 it doesn't work, and so it won't populate that the field, and that's why you need that here. Okay, so you add flight here, and I have here the utils. I call the utils function, or class really. This utils, I'll show you what it looks like, is just basically for validation. Okay, so if you look down the very bottom down here, before I submit, I called the validation form, and the validation form is down here. So when I validate, there's a lot to validate, right? You're going to validate the flight data, all those information here. So you don't have to do this. I'm just showing you how it's done, but you can do it differently. And so I prep this object. I'm going to pass all of these to a function called validate all inside the utils library, or in this case, it's a class. So this way, you can see that my validation is kind of short because it actually ends here, right? I pass everything to that. When it comes back, my object comes back, and I receive it here, and then I just update my errors and the requirements. If you don't do it this way, then you can do it this way, like I did here. I turn all these off, but you see that this is the actual validation. You can put it all here if you want. It's just pretty long, so I moved it out. But you see that it's all here. Let me just turn this back on so you can see. And see, there's a lot of them. So you can see I validate the dates, departure date. Make sure the departure date is not earlier than the return date. So you put an error here. You check to see the date is valid. I mean, it cannot be blank, right? Because once you receive the date, it comes in as a string. So you put validation here. You validate the same thing with the departure date. Airports again, make sure they meet their minimum requirements. They're not empty, and the return airports is not the same as the departure airport. That's you get the error message here. Okay, and I put each error messages here assigned to another property in the validation requirements here, so you can see what those are. So all these are just basically all the validation you have here. So instead of doing all this here, comment this out, right? I move that into another class, and the U class is called utils. So they're all here, right? It's the same thing down here. See all these validation here? I put into functions instead now. But since this function is reusable, so you want to code in such a way so that anything that passed to it can work. And these functions are exactly the same functions used in the edit form as well. Because the edit and the add they use exactly the same form I showed you earlier, right? So when you validate, it's exactly the same. The only difference is the ID field, which means if the ID field, if you're editing and if the ID is the same, then you don't have to do any validation, right? Unless they're different. Or if it's coming from the add, then yeah, you have to validate that. Okay. But if you don't do this, then you just do it in random number, then you can also still check that. So all the functions are here. I have those functions, one each available by themselves, or I can have another function that you can pass in the object and it does all that for you and it return the object back, right? And that's why I have here the objects return back to this object because you're passing everything through an object as a reference. You make any changes in here, it also changes um, everything outside here as well. That's why everything comes back intact. Okay. Um, Also on the very top, I put all my error messages here as well, and these are error messages for the form. It's kind of useful to do it this way instead of hard coding like I did here, like down here, hard coding the error messages like this. I would say, oh, sorry, ID exists. Put it rather than putting text right here. If you have a lot of these, if you only have about two or three, it doesn't matter. But if you have a lot, then it's ideal to put all your messages in its own place, and you reference those messages when one of them is one of them fails, right? And then same thing here, my validation requirements. I put here for each field. So the ID field is required, has a minimum of one character, one number, and a maximum of, you decide that. And error just means has an error message. I should have called error message, but I just call error. If there's any error, it'll be true, and you put a string here. And then the flight number, same thing. And I added three more additional fields here. I mean, if the ID already existed, then you put a message here. Or you can also add this to the same as additional one. That's fine too. It's up to you. The same airport error, again, same thing. If you are returning to the same airport, that error message go here. And this flag becomes true. You put the message here. And the dates error is also, I mean, you cannot be, you can't return the same date, I guess. I mean, it's possible, but we just make it so that you can't. Same date, I think that's fine. I'm just saying you cannot return a date time in the past. Okay, so all these are here in the utils, and so when you import that up here with the very top, if I go up to the top here, you import that in here, and then it's a class, so you instantiate that, so you can use it. Now through these utils, I have access to all of those. That's why I can get the error messages. I assign that to a local variable. I assign all the requirements to a local variable. I can use it here. And because all this is a reference, when I make changes, it actually changes the data here as well. Okay, and that's the thing about objects and references. And yeah, so that's what happens in this add flight. When you handle change, a lot of things going on here. And when you submit, some things go in here. I just basically, this part is to trim white spaces. And then you validate the form. Once you validate the form, it comes back. You check for the error flag. This error flag, is it true or false? That is because that's why I down here in my validation, when you go to validate, make that false, and then when you send that to validation, you come back out. This object returns here, and you want to get the state of that error message. So you put it into this error message here, and so you can check it out here in this function here. If there's no error, then go ahead and add the flight. Otherwise, you just throw the error on the screen. And again, I'm calling the flight services.add flight. So this flight again is the one inside the function here. As you can see, very simple process. You just push it to the new to the list. Okay, so that's the add flight. The edit is very similar. You see, this is the edit here. This is the edit file. Actually, there's a lot of the same here. So again, I'm adding the util. I'm using the validators and form group for control because this is a reactive form, right? And my add flight, I did not use that. I'm using a template-driven form. So edit basically looks very similar. The interface here is needed because I need to when I run it, you need to have some data type with some data to populate your form. And I showed you in a separate video what the importance of that is. And so in here is exactly almost the same as before. My global flight data, my actual flight data type here. Instead of filling with some fake data, some preset data, I'm just using this as a data type. Okay, it's the shape of my object. And then the form group here is to create all these form groups here. So you can see that my forms now, I did all these validation here, required the minimum length, the maximum length, all here I did everything in the code, right? And each of these fields here, the ID field, flight number field, airline, all those 8 fields are all here. And everything is done in the code now because using reactive form. And so you have control of what to show, what not to show, or how you validate your form. You do mostly in the code here. You have control of that. Yeah, but the rest are kind of the same. Okay, so you can see the handle change is exactly the same. So you could really just move that into another function again, into the utils, and then use it here, make your file much shorter, because I'm duplicating here. The handle submit is exactly the same, right? And then the validation is also exactly the same. The same here, no difference here. The only difference is the action type. I put edit here, whereas over here, I think I use add. So down here, when I send it for the validation, you can see I put add here because the action is add, and this is edit. And the difference is because I'm checking to see if I need to either update the ID or not. If they're the same, then for edit, you don't need to, right? That's the only thing I need to do. But everything else is exactly the same. Okay, so I'm going to show you what that template looks like. Let's look at the edit template and then the add template as well. So let's look at the add template first. It's just a template driven form. As you can see, it looks very similar, just like your regular form. I mean, a lot of Angular code in here, but the form starts here, line 17, and you give it a name because you give it a unique name, that's all, flight data. This is the name of that form, and it's a part of the ng form. This is a directive in Angular. So you basically saying tell Angular this is one of your forms. It's called flight data form. If you have a second form here, you have to give a different name, right? Just give a unique name so Angular knows which form to manage. And in here, I have my tag. So here's the tag for the input. From here to here, it's pretty long, as you can see. So I give it a name for the tag. Okay, I give it a class. This class here calls a function to return either if there's error or not. I mentioned in a separate video how to do that, so that I can invoke the invalid feedback. This invalid feedback is a bootstrap, so in order for this to work, one of the classes here must say is invalid, and it will trigger this class down here as well. So they are dependent of each other. And then the type I made it so it's type number. I put the minimum requirement, the minimum here, so I call it directly from the field, and the maximum here. And then this field is bound to the ng model as a unique ID field. So again, this looks very similar to the pound sign up here. That means I'm creating a local variable in the form tag. Okay, this is a local variable called ID, and because it's local here, I can use it in here as well for Angular. I do a data binding here. This is a two-way data binding to the ID field of the flight data. So any changes I made will also reflect in the actual data. And I also add a keep up event. So every keystroke I make will invoke this function and update the data in there, and I made this required, right? Like your typical HTML tag. And these are just some error messages here. So one error message here, and so because I'm using this ID field, okay, I'm doing two validations here. One, I'm using the this is my local validation. This value rex is my value rex over here. As you can see, I have an object way in the top. I call it um, yeah, valid requirements, right? Come from that field, and I check for what type of error it is. Okay, so if it has the ID has a maximum error, ID has an error, or if now these two are Angular's validation. Okay, the ID here refers to this # ID here. That's why you're creating a local variable in the template to use it here. Okay, so if this has an error, and I'll explain in separate video what this means, it means it meets the requirements because it's required, and it has an error because it has a minimum length errors, refers to this minimum character here, then it throws an error and show this error. Okay, if it's ID already exists, then again I call my exist. If it's true, then display a separate error as well. So if both are true in this case, then you see two messages here. Okay, and so the same for the flight number, right? Here is the flight number here, the name, the make it so it's uppercase, the class again either valid or not valid, and the maximum length, minimum length. I need to put you can put it here. The flight number again, any unique ID, unique object variable you can use inside your template here. I use it down here for the validation. Again, this part is my validation using Angular's validation. This is my own validation here. Okay, so you can do one of both of them. All right, and so on. So that it looks like, right? Just like your typical form. Now let's head over to the edit HTML. The edit, let's go to the top. Here is the beginning of the form. It looks quite different, somewhat different. Instead of the #, right, I put form group. I put into bracket here equals to the form. This is my variable, my object. This form here is the name of the form. Whereas over here, this is the name of the form. I call it flight data, but this one I call it just form because it's shorter. Because it's called form, I can reference it inside the template here as well. So as you can see, form that controls errors and so on. So now if you look at the ID tag, it's a little bit shorter from here to here compared to this from here to here, right? See, there's a lot from this to file, very short. And so now I still need the ID here, and then I can still add the validation class here because I'm doing my own validation, and but using just an Angular validation, I don't really need this. Okay, I need that because I need to trigger this part. Otherwise, this will be not needed, and you will use a different class here. Okay, and then and that makes it really, really short. And so I just put the types number and I just put the form control name. That's it. I don't put required, the minimum, maximum, all those stuff here. I don't need it because I control those in the source. Okay, let's look down here at the flight number. So again, from here to here, the flight number, this is just a style sheet to uppercase. I need to do that. I added the key up event. Again, this is really not needed, but I did it anyway. And the ID for the class. So if these are not needed, okay, these are optional. If I take all these out, you see that that's all you need really. The maximum I don't need it here. Yeah, I could just put it inside the form control. I put it here because I want to force restrict so that you cannot type more than 20 characters on the form itself. But you can control this directly in the code as well. So it makes it really, really short if you omit all the CSS stuff. Okay. From that to, if I go back to this one, I can compare the things I don't need. For example, like this part, I don't need that. Let's just say I don't need those two. Okay, but I need the maximum and the minimum. I need a flight number. I need to bind that data here. So this, right, I need a data binding here. Compared to this one, there's no data binding because it's all bound to the form control object. Okay, so it's really, really short here. And so you put the minimum things you need here because most of these controls are inside here. I mean, inside here, right? So you see that in here at the very top. I control all the things here. So I make flight number, right? I give it this is the actual data. The validations all here. Like it's required, has a minimum length, a maximum length, and so on. You can, if it's an email, you just put that email, and you can add your own custom validation here as well. So you control all those stuff inside the code, whereas this one here you control in the template. That's why it's called template driven, and this is called the reactive driven or reactive form. All right, that's a lot to absorb, but I just want to give you a quick view of what it looks like, and I'll do separate videos to show you in at smaller steps how these are done. So hopefully those will help you, and I hope that you have something built for this course, and also to take it with you as your portfolio and for your own learning and so on. So if you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to let me know and send me questions. All right, thank you.